So moving on to 8.2.31, we get one that investigates bias in jury selection. And it says, in the case of Castaneda versus Partiga, it was found that during a period of 11 years in Hidalgo County, Texas, 870 people were selected for grand jury duty, and 39% of them were Americans of Mexican ancestry. Among the people eligible for grand jury duty, 79.1% were Americans of Mexican ancestry. Use a 0.01 significance level to test the claim. Sorry about that. All I wanted to do was highlight here. Use a 0.01 significance level to test the claim that the selection process is biased against Americans of Mexican ancestry. Then we get the interpretation question of, does the jury selection system appear to be biased? So, if we look at the true percent of Americans of Mexican ancestry that are available for grand jury duty, that's 79.1%. And if your system is unbiased, you would expect the percent of Americans of Mexican ancestry that sit on grand juries would be equal to this. And if not identically equal to it, something really close to 79.1%. So the equal case, if the percentage equals 79.1%, that would represent an unbiased case. Biased is going to be off from there. So if we're less than 79.1%, that is going to represent a biased case. And if the proportion is greater than 79.1%, that would also be a biased case. But we're talking about bias in a certain direction. So if it's biased against them, are they going to be overrepresented, or are they going to be underrepresented in a case where it's biased against them? Well, in this case, if they're overrepresented, that would be in favor of them. That would mean that they would, in this case, kind of have more power in terms of what's going on. So if the proportion was greater than 79.1, this would be a case where it was biased in favor of them. Where they're underrepresented in this case, that is the case where it is biased against them. So took a little bit of thinking through what does it mean to be biased versus unbiased. And then with bias, there can be direction. There can be there can be a good bias for them. There can be a bad bias for them. Biased against is the bad bias, and that is the case where the proportion percentage is less than the 79.1% that are eligible for grand jury duty. So that's the less than case. Our opposite or negation has to include the other two. It has to include the greater than. It also has to include the equal. So at this point, everything else for this problem is going to fall out just like our previous two did. So we put in our labels for null and alternate, and whatever numbers and parameter appear in our claim, that's what's going to be over in our hypothesis statement. In between them in the null is the equal, because it's always the equal in between them in the null. And then we want the strict inequality between them in the alternate hypothesis. So the hypothesis statement, we've made that with the proper symbols. And again, I recommend going one little bit further. We put in the R, we put in the S, and then we see which part here matches the claim. If not identical, as close to it as possible. And it is the alternate hypothesis that represents it in this case. So when it comes time to write the conclusion with respect to the claim, the S there is for whether or not we're going to support the claim that, and then a copy paste of the claim, the selection process is biased against Americans of Mexican ancestry. The only remaining part of the conclusion is whether or not we have the evidence. So we either have sufficient or insufficient evidence to. So by the time we wrap up writing our hypothesis statement, we're one word away from wrapping up our conclusion with respect to the claim. So now it's about getting all the pieces we need to go ahead, find the test statistic, find the p-value, and decide whether or not we're rejecting the null hypothesis. So our tail of the test here, that is pointing to the left, this is a left tail test. And for the first time, we're getting a significance level that's not 0.05. And the reason they're picking a lower one here is they want to avoid a type 1 error. They want to avoid a false positive. It's a pretty serious claim if you're going to claim that somebody is biased against somebody else. You don't want the false positive there. So they want really compelling evidence before they move forward and say, hey, your system is biased against Americans of Mexican ancestry. So that's why that significance level was chosen to be lower there. So our significance level is 0.01, and the sample size was 870, and the sample proportion was 39%. So when we go to find the number of Americans of Mexican ancestry in the sample, we're going to have to just multiply these two together and round off to the nearest whole number. And so when we multiply them together, we get 339.3, which just rounds off to 339. We're also go ahead and set our rule of rejection. And again, the first part of it, reject null hypothesis if p-value is less than or equal. That part of the rule of rejection never ever changes. It's always p-value less than or equal, and in this case it's the 0.01. And now we're ready to go ahead and move on over to statdisk. So we go analysis, hypothesis testing, proportion 1 sample. This time our alternate hypothesis was the less than. This is why I ask you to identify the tail, to put it in mind that you're going to need that at some point. Significance level changed this time. Our claim proportion, that's the proportion in the claim. Sample size 870, number of successes 339. We can hit evaluate and plot, and as we see in our plot, we fall off in the tail. We fall off way the heck off in the tail there. Our test statistic here is negative 29.115. We're more than 29 standard deviations below what is expected if they had an unbiased selection method for the grand jury. Our critical value was only about 2 1/3 standard deviations. And our p-value here is showing zeros out 4 decimal places. Now, it's not identically equal to 0, but by the time you go out 4 decimal places of all zeros, you're going to be less than whatever your chosen significance level is. So let's go back to our sheet and put this in. So our test statistic Z was negative 29.115. Our p-value was, for all practical purposes, 0. This is kind of a 0 plus that they talked about earlier in the course. And 0 is definitely less than 0.01. So we reject the null hypothesis, and when we reject the null hypothesis, we have the evidence to support the claim that the selection process is biased against Americans of Mexican ancestry. So we have the evidence to support that it is. So does the jury system appear to be biased? Oh yeah. That is, I mean, their sample percent of 39%, yeah, that seems like it's a long way from 79.1%. It feels like it's a long way from it. And because nobody cares how we feel, that's telling us, yeah, this is miles away from what we would expect.
So just for my students who are watching, you know that I tend to take this class into political territory quite often. You're seeing some of the true power behind what we're doing in this class, in this problem. This is one of my favorite problems to walk through and talk through, because we can take concrete sample-based evidence and we can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt, statistically speaking, that we have this bias in this particular political group. So this is something that can be used to make public policy decisions, right? This is something that you can take back to the local board that would be in charge of this grand jury selection process and say, look, here's this evidence. We need to make some changes.
Now, I'm always hesitant to use the word prove because,
yes,
but I mean, so this is very compelling evidence. So like, if this was a criminal trial where somebody's accused of knocking over a liquor store, you've got it on video, you've got their fingerprints all over. They were live tweeting it out, Snapchatting the thing, and they've signed a confession and about 5 other pieces of evidence where reasonable doubt is way back in the rear view mirror. So,
thank you.
Yep.